Massachusetts. Recording is in progress. My name is Michael Favala Goldman. I'm representing Straw Dog Writers. Each year, Voices for Resistance provides a platform for writers at the peak of their craft, writers who are challenging the dominant paradigm. For example, on the subjects of gender, race, cultural diversity, neurodiversity, and we are very pleased tonight to welcome 5 authors who educate us and help us to move toward becoming an increasingly mutually supportive community. Our readers this evening are Thérèse Chehade, Neema Avashia, Dahlma Llanos, Figueroa, Steve Edwards, and Daisy Hernández. As they're reading, feel free to write in the chat as you are moved. Our MC tonight is Andrea Hairston. Our honorary host is Kim Gerould. I want to thank Forbes Library for co-hosting this event with us. Molly Moss, the assistant director of Forbes, is with us. So let me pass the baton to her for a few words on the library's behalf.
We are so thrilled to be able to co-host this wonderful event again. I want to welcome everybody here, and I will put in some information in the chat in a minute to how you can continue to be aware of events that we have at the library or get on one of our mailing lists. But I will keep my words brief so we can get on with the main event.
Thank you, Molly, for supporting Voices for Resistance. Next, we are going to hear from our honorary host for this evening, Kim Gerould, from the David Ruggles Center for History and Education in Florence, Massachusetts. Kim is a retired educator, an activist, and the co-founder of the local grassroots organization, Families with Power. She's a tour guide for the Ruggles Center, and she also serves on their board of directors. Please welcome Kim Gerould. You're still muted, yes.
Okay.
There we go.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Such an honor for me to be your honorary host. I welcome the writers, the readers, and all of you here. It's very exciting to see your faces, your names. I wish we were in person, but this is pretty exciting. As Michael said, I am representing the David Ruggles Center in Florence for History and Education. And when I heard the title for this event tonight, Voices for Resistance, I thought of the long history of such voices in our valley here in the Pioneer Valley. And I think these are traditions that tonight's writers are carrying forward. I hope that my few words tonight will make you want to visit our website if you're not local, and come visit us and take a tour and learn more about these people who were definitely challenging the dominant paradigm, as Michael so eloquently put. At our center, we interpret the history of radical reformers, both Black and white, women and men, who created a so-called utopian community in 1840s Florence. They named it the Northampton Association of Education and Industry, and they were working for the abolition of slavery, for women's rights, among other causes. And some of its members you probably know, like Sojourner Truth. She came here because of that group of people. Samuel Hill, who's a local hero in Florence. Others, like the Black abolitionist David Ruggles, who our center is named for, should be more well known. He was a leader in New York City of the Underground Railroad. He helped more than 600 people out of slavery, including the young Frederick Douglass. He organized in the community. He fought the rampant kidnapping that was happening of both fugitives and free Blacks. And he was a writer, he was a publisher, he sold books. He had the first Black abolitionist bookstore in the country. And later he came here to Florence and became a respected and beloved member of the association. Other local voices of resistance that are not so well known that we raise up are African-American community members such as Basil Dorsey, Sarah Askins, Stephen Rush, and white abolitionists like Lydia Mariah Child and George Benson. These activists were writers, they wrote for newspapers, they were speakers. They spoke in downtown Northampton, they spoke in the outdoor Pine Grove, which is behind the Bombyx Center. That was a big meeting place for all kinds of speakers like Garrison and Frederick Douglass. These people also provided shelter and guidance to self-emancipated Blacks who were coming through here on the Underground Railroad, and some of whom actually settled here in Florence. These people lived in dangerous and trying times, as we do today in many ways. Slavery was alive and well then, women's rights were few, and their stories and words and actions continue to inspire us. And I know that the authors that we are about to hear from tonight will do the same. Thank you very much.
Wow. So I am totally inspired by all that you have said, and I know the writers that we're about to hear from will continue that. COVID has, kept me contained. And so I am thrilled that we have this wonderful group of writers. And the first one is Thérèse Chehade, and coming to us from South Hadley. Her novel Loom won the 2011 Arab American Award in the fiction category. So she will read to us now.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you, Forbes and Straw Dog Writers, and thank you, Anna Smith. I saw you earlier for inviting me. It is such an honor, and I'm grateful to be here. I will be reading from a new novel, and the novel is set in Lebanon, which is where I'm from, and it's set during the Lebanese Civil War. And this lasted from 1975 to 1990. And in this particular chapter or section of a chapter, the main character, Rita, she's 14 years old, and it is during the war, and the fighting has come really close to their neighborhood. And so they have to go to the shelter, which is right next door. Just in keeping with the theme for tonight, one of the themes that I did explore for this novel was how do you survive when you're surrounded by unspeakable violence, and how do you keep your humanity? We sat up abruptly in our beds, sleep torn away from our eyes. The sky sparked. Thick clouds of smoke billowed behind the line of trees. I looked at Russia. In her, I saw what I must have looked like, my chest heaving, my face pale as bone. Everything shook. I held on tight to the edge of the bed, the rattling windows the only thing separating us from the outside. Our mother's voice found us. Hurry, she cried. We fumbled for our slippers. In the entryway, my mother waved a candle. Tonight we would hide in the basement. We were ready. We knew the day would come, the fighting at our doorstep. Weeks ago we had stacked blankets on the shelf, left a suitcase by the door. It took a while to decide what to pack. We made lists. We were ruthless. We are not going on vacation, my mother said. My mother's eyes darted around. She put out the candle and handed Russia a flashlight, grabbed the blankets and tucked them under her arm. My father bent down and lifted Tony to his chest with one hand and the suitcase with the other. After we filed out, Mama locked the door and wrapped a knuckle to the frosted glass windows to make sure they were locked. We poured down the steps, Russia ahead, shining the flashlight at an angle. Red and orange flashes cut across the square of sky above our building. A shadow appeared on the balcony across the courtyard. It was Lena's mother. They were staying put. Here or the shelter, whatever will be, she said, her voice trailing off in the explosions. We stopped in the lobby. The driveway lay ahead, then the sidewalk that led to Sita's building where the shelter was located. Tonight, the path was deadly, yet we had no choice. The shells fell on the next sector behind the belt of trees. Soon they would reach us. It was now or never. My mother made the sign of the cross. We hunched our shoulders and surged ahead, Russia first, followed by my father and Tony. My mother and I went last. We ran into a blast of heat and soot, our eyes glued to the ground. We didn't want to see the shells arching through the sky and their exploding light. We looked down and ran. I tore away from them. I left them behind. My father, who carried Tony, Tony, who clamped his palms over his ears, my mother with her burden of blankets, and Russia shining the flashlight. I reached Seta's building first. I stood in a corner of the lobby against the wall, and my father didn't see me when he entered and had to call my name. A door opened onto narrow steps leading down to the shelter. We stopped midway for my mother to catch her breath. I slumped against her, releasing quick puffs of air to still my heart. Below us, the light made wide, impatient arcs. It was Russia pressing us on. I relieved my mother of her blankets and linked my arm with hers on the stairs. The shelter was bathed in the dusky light of fuel lamps. At first, everything was a jumble of shapes. We walked slowly, picking our way through the figures on the floor. A small space appeared a few rows down. We set down our blankets and collapsed. A few minutes later, we sat up to examine our location. When our eyes adjusted to the dark, we saw women with babies and children sleeping on their stomachs, and men with transistor radios pressed to their ears, pacing the floor in search of good reception. We recognized a few familiar faces and gave nods in greeting. We were as solemn as churchgoers. I sat with my back against the wall. A man eyed my chest. I was not wearing a bra, and my pajama top was missing a button. I folded my arms across my chest and glared at him until he lowered his eyes. Next to me, Mama was searching the suitcase for Tony's socks. I clasped my top with one hand and helped her look. I found the socks and slipped them on my brother's feet, then tickled his stomach. He squealed and wriggled free from my grip, then went and fastened himself to my mother. Every once in a while, the men with the radios looked up and recapped the news. Fighting had spread to most of the city. Bodies were floating in the sea. We listened in silence. When the batteries of one radio expired, we gazed at the next man with a radio. I recognized the names of familiar neighborhoods. My city was being pounded. The Rivoli, where we watched Egyptian movies with Mama. The Automatique that served chocolate mousse in long fluted glasses. The seaside boardwalk. I would never know the real Beirut, the way my parents and Russia knew it, in its secret alleys and shortcuts and bordellos and nightclubs. I would remember it the way a child remembers things, through the intermediary of adults. A feeling of immense loss washed over me. I lay down on my side and pulled the blanket over my face. It was how I slept at home in the darkness under the covers. I shut my eyes tightly, but a fire blazed behind my eyelids. The floor shook with every explosion, and rage burned in my chest. I hated them. I hated them all. We were not safe here. How could we have believed that we were? We were rats in shallow holes. I rolled into a ball and whined. Soon I was sobbing. I heard my parents' voices over the bombs, but nothing they said could comfort me. We were the almost dead. Above us, the bombs thundered, sirens screamed, and fires raged. The trees thrashed and dropped their smoldering branches. A voice inside my brain said, "You will die today." Another got cross when I fell apart. "Keep your head between your knees," she snapped when I made a spectacle of myself. "Release your mind. Remember the happy times," she said. "Breathe into them a second life. Otherwise, the past will be erased and the war will have won." The memories unrolled in my head. I stood on the rooftop of our building. The sea stretched behind the staggered buildings. Everything but the blue of sky and water vanished. I danced. Dahlia, my friend in the 7th grade. She wore a red bikini. We were at her uncle's chalet at the beach resort with the octagon pool and beaded shower curtain. She danced an African dance she had learned in Ghana, where she'd spent her childhood. We grilled fish on a small coal grill, then jumped in the pool. I climbed on her shoulders and she threw me back in the water. When her uncle was away, we climbed the shoulders of boys. But our play was innocent because it happened in the water, where it was normal to be half naked with your thighs clasped around a boy you hardly knew, and your crotch gently rubbing the back of his neck, and your legs knee-deep in the glory of summer. The bombs crashed, but I was in that wave of time, and a voice said, "Stay here. Time is running out, so grasp it now." Thank you.
Ooh, wow. Okay, I forgot to say that after we have all these amazing readings, we'll have a discussion with the authors, and then we'll have also questions from the audience. So as you listen to these wonderful readings, perhaps you can think of things you want to ask the authors. Okay, our next reader is Neema Avashia, and they're in Jamaica Plain, Massachusetts. Her first book, Another Appalachia, Coming Up Queer and Indian in a Mountain Place, was published by WVU Press in March 2022.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here, and thanks for that introduction. I'm going to read to you one essay from my essay collection, which is called Another Appalachia, Coming Up Queer and Indian in a Mountain Place. That picture on the front is my family and my sort of adopted aunties and uncles and adopted siblings, kind of, who were in this very small Indian community that I grew up in rural West Virginia. And the essay that I'm going to read to you today is called A History of Guns. It's a list essay, so you're going to hear a countdown a little bit in it. A History of Guns. 10. The number of guns in my neighbor's gun rack on Pamela's Circle. On occasion, after our post-school snack of pickle sandwiches and pudding cups, his son and I took them out of the cabinet in his den. We huddled in the wood-paneled basement, stroked the burnished metal on the barrels, ran our fingers over the honeyed grain of the stocks. These guns, antiques made and used 100 years before my parents set foot on the tarmac at JFK after their first transatlantic flight, held me in their thrall. They were beautiful, majestic, something to collect, the same way we hoarded the Indian head pennies and arrowheads we found on our walks in the woods. Something I knew would never be found in my immigrant parents' home. Guns were too American for our nerdy, Gandhi-loving Indian family. I might turn them in my hands, wrists slightly bent by their heft, for brief moments on lazy afternoons, but I knew they would never be mine. 9. The number of years I've been teaching the Second Amendment to my students in Boston and trying to explain its continued relevance in this era of extreme gun violence. I try to be the bridge between red and blue. I channel my West Virginia roots and neighbors to conjure the pro-Second Amendment arguments, but my Massachusetts liberal students are born and raised in an echo chamber, and many have seen the impacts of gun violence firsthand. They have a response every time. We need the Second Amendment to prevent government tyranny, I say. And kids say, have you seen what's happening in Syria? Guns don't stop tanks and bombs. I say, we need the Second Amendment because people love to hunt. And kids say, you couldn't eat a deer killed by an AR-15. Every bite would be full of shrapnel. I say, we need the Second Amendment for personal protection. And kids say, you don't need an AR-15 to protect yourself from a home invader. And though I grew up with guns, though guns did not frighten me when I was a child, I too read the Boston Globe every day, watch the homicide count in my city tick higher and higher, and think, they are right, they are right, they are right. 8. The number of miles between my house and Camp Virgil Tate, a massive span of grass and woods where I learned to fish and identify edible plants like sumac and milkweed and spot poison ivy and shoot a bow and arrow and load, aim, fire, reload. Holes riddled the edges of the paper target. Stalks of hay flew off the bale it was pinned to, but my aim never improved to the point where I even hit the outer circles of the target. Unsurprising, coming from a kid who couldn't cut with scissors, jump rope, or draw a straight line to save her life. Unnecessary, too, for a vegetarian with no intentions of hunting. And yet there is this part of me that feels that I have failed, that the inability to accurately load, aim, fire, reload is further proof that I'm an imposter in this place where I was born, but I'm never quite sure that I belong. 7. The number of minutes from my house on Pamela Circle to the spot on Goff Mountain Road where my father dropped off the squirrels and rabbits he lured with peanut butter and trapped in metal cages to prevent them from destroying his garden. I'm taking them to Goff Mountain College, he told me. Someday you'll go there too. Meanwhile, our backyard neighbor sat on the grass in the evenings, shirtless, with a rifle perched between his legs. The squirrels and rabbits that entered his yard got shot, not trapped. Last year, when a squirrel, I named him Simon, invaded my house, waking me each morning with his gnawing of wood, covering my porch with his urine and feces, leaving a pizza crust on the railings, I found myself filled with unexpected murderous rage. I knocked him off the railing once with a broomstick. He fell 2 stories, hit the ground with a thud, and then blithely scampered away. I explored trapping, but learned that wildlife traps are illegal in Massachusetts. And I began to think of my neighbor and his gun. I, vegetarian, Hindu, raised as a pacifist with terrible aim, fantasized about shooting Simon. What would I look like sitting on my back porch in Boston, a gun perched on my lap, waiting for the squirrel to scurry onto the scene? Please don't, Laura said. You do that here and someone's going to call the police on you in minutes. 6. The number of chambers in the pistol my down the street neighbor, just out of high school, used the night he played Russian roulette and lost, sending a bullet slamming into his own brain. I was in middle school at the time. He once helped us build a deck off the side of my friend's clubhouse, a hodgepodge of plywood and wood scraps brought home from the lumber company his dad owned. Compared to my scrawny self, he was the big kid with the hammer, and I still see him straddling the beam, hammering away at a piece of plywood, a white baseball cap on his head, cradling the tender brain that would implode just a few years later. 5. The number of minutes away I was from Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh on October 27, 2018, when gunmen entered the sanctuary, murdered 11 people, and injured 6 more. In town for a 50th anniversary celebration of the creative writing department at Carnegie Mellon, I spent those morning hours locked in a basement on campus, my mind completely taken up with questions about who was at the synagogue that day. Which professors, which neighbors from my time living in Squirrel Hill, which expat West Virginians now living in Pittsburgh might be affected. We tried to carry on with the reading. I awkwardly shared the story I'd planned to read all along, one about a nighttime outing with young people where we used graffiti to grieve the loss of their peers to gun violence, wondered at its wild inappropriateness or its fitting appropriateness for this painful moment. I called Laura during a break to tell her where I was, to explain the shelter in place. She asked me, "Love, are you okay?" I didn't know how to answer her, how to explain that my body and brain still have not adjusted to an America where guns outnumber people, where guns are not Indian head pennies or arrowheads, but rather weapons of a war we wage on each other. 4. The number of times we practice containment each year at my urban middle school in Boston, once per term. We've perfected the routine. Close the blinds, lock and cover the door, place a green sign in the window if all students are accounted for, a yellow one for missing students, a red one if anyone is injured. Text the administrators a picture of the class attendance, huddle in the corner, jam between the sink and the garbage can, with 28 adolescents desperately trying to keep quiet, or 24 adolescents trying to stay quiet, and 4 farting, burping, and doing anything they can to get their peers' attention. My students have so many questions about these drills. Would we really stay locked in the room if we heard gunshots? What would we do if the shooter came through a side door? What about the rooms whose doors do not lock? Aren't we teaching potential school shooters in our midst all of our strategies and plans by practicing these drills again and again? 3, the number of shots fired at Angel, the sweetest of students, just 15 years old, killed on a street corner in South Boston at 11:30 p.m. 4 Novembers ago. The 4th beloved young person to die by gunshot that year. The 4th funeral I attended where I outlived the person in the casket by a full 2 decades. He baked me a fruitcake at Christmas the year I taught him. 2 shots to the head, 1 shot to the neck, 0, the number of times I want to see, hear, or touch a gun again. Thank you.
Ah, thank you, thank you, thank you. Wow. Our next reader is Dahlma Llanos Figueroa, and she is in Bronx, New York. Her first novel, Daughters of the Stone, was a 2010 PEN Bingham finalist.
Hello, everyone. Tonight, I would like to read from my second novel, which was just published. It's called A Woman of Endurance. And it follows the life of one captured African woman. And she's just gone through Middle Passage. And I'd like to read the section where she first arrives in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Excuse me. Forgetting these. Port of San Juan, Puerto Rico, November 1836. When she was taken from her home place, she had been Kira, a comely young woman with rounded hips, strong legs, and a flash of a smile. The woman who arrived on this other shore, this Puerto Rico, now renamed Pola by her captors, had 3 crooked fingers and 4 missing teeth, and had been brutalized by every member of the crew. After the full moon had come and gone 4 times, and the floating hell had made 3 stops, less than half of the original group of captives remained. Pola was taken to the upper deck for the last time. She had been below for so many weeks that the sun was blinding. When her eyes finally adapted to the light, she looked out on a new world. This, it seemed, was to be her destination. Up and down the shoreline, a long line of ships had pulled up in a place where the sea had taken a huge bite out of the land. Wooden planks stretched from ship to shore. Pola and the rest of the captives were herded onto the deck under guard. Earlier, they had been hosed down and scrubbed clean under the careful eye of the crew. They were given makeshift clothes that barely covered their nakedness. The women were given cloths to cover their tangled hair. Men were shorn of their matted beards and their heads were shaven. Food had become more plentiful in the past few weeks, and now they were fed one last meal on board. During the voyage, they had been separated by gender, but now they were chained in specific configurations, including men, boys, and women and young boys. The group was suddenly in the midst of more commotion than Pola had seen since leaving home. Unchained, shirtless Black men toiled in the morning sun. Most of these workers took care not to look at the captives directly as they stood in their rags and chains. The workers simply walked by, intent on unloading crates, which were then taken to squat buildings lining the shore. Some stepped carefully around the chained group, hoisting large, oddly shaped bundles and huge sacks that went directly into waiting wagons. Not one of them said a word, pretending not to notice the band of half-naked, bony Black people, mostly men, who stood to one side. One young boy tripped, dropped his load, and bent down to retrieve it. As he stood up again, he looked directly into Pola's eyes for a moment. She stared back and held his gaze. There she read all she needed to know about his life, and she could see that he read all he needed to know about hers. Pola recognized the sadness she felt pressing against her eyes, alive in his. His was an infinitesimal nod. She slowly pulled at the rag that barely covered her naked breasts. Someone called, the boy was jostled. The moment passed, and they went on to face their lives in this place that neither of them had chosen. The ship had slipped in between dozens of others that had already dropped anchor or were moored at the harbor, their masts a collection of sticks prodding the low-swung blanket of clouds. As she stood waiting for the non-human cargo to be offloaded, Paula was shocked by the number of people who filled the area below. It seemed that in this place, the market was right on the shoreline, as though people couldn't wait until the merchants got to the village center to hold their sales. But before she could observe much else, a strong jerk on her arm commanded her attention. She was being pulled onto a narrow plank of wood that led from the vessel to the shore. Chained to a line of men and women, she cringed as she imagined one of them slipping and all of them drowning amid the waterlogged, rotting flotsam between the ship and the dock. Decaying food, dead animals, and human waste filled the air with a choking stench. The babble that rose around them as they stood on the pier was deafening. It sounded like no speech Paula had ever heard, the words jagged, grating sounds that attacked the ear. She realized that she was listening to not one, but many languages, and recognized an odd word or two of the language of her captors. Their language was as offensive as their behavior. Then Paula's eyes fell on the white women in the crowd. They wore long dresses covering them from neck to foot, many pointing into boxes and picking their way through open packages, being sold right there from the waterfront. She noticed that some of the women had straw-colored hair hanging down to their shoulders. They carried little umbrellas and wore round boxes on their heads and thin netting floating over their eyes. Paula was reminded of the beaded and colorful masks worn by believers dancing for the gods back home. But these paled by comparison. They were colorless and flimsy. There was nothing ceremonial about the movements of the women who were focused on grabbing and exchanging paper for the objects before them. White men stood by waving sticks and gesturing to Black bare-breasted men who hoisted and heaved rope cargo. From the bridge, they had looked like Black worker ants running back and forth around the freight that had already been unloaded. But up close, Paula could see the weariness, the straining bodies, smell the sweat of laborers who, much like herself, had no time to care for themselves. The line of captives snaked through the harbor crowds and onto an open area full of men in hats who stood yelling and waving their arms, laughing and passing jugs around. She was herded into the corner of a square to await her turn at the stake in the center, where one captive after another was exhibited to men waving the pieces of paper. There was much back and forth, and then paper changed hands and the purchase was dragged away. When it was her turn to stand at the block, Paula was released from her chains and dragged onto the platform to the pole, where she was tethered once again. Mother Yemaya, where are you now when I need you most? She closed her eyes. She thought about all that had already been taken from her, her lovely fingers, her teeth, her body, her untouched womanhood, her laughter. But they hadn't taken everything. She clung to her faith, her soul, her secret, the seed she knew was already growing within her. She smelled the tobacco, sweat, and rancid breaths as fingers poked, hands examined her scalp, squeezed her breasts, and slapped her buttocks. Someone pulled back her lip and dug into her mouth. She bit down as hard as she could. The loud male cry was followed by a stinging slap that knocked her down, leaving her hanging from the ropes that bound her to the stake. She was now dragged up again, and then hands rubbed at her belly and below, digging and jabbing at her bruised insides. Men laughed, then argued. The hands went away, and they were done. The auctioneer jabbed at the young boy hanging back behind the platform. He was dressed in breeches and a shirt much like some of the men in the back of the crowd. Apunta ahí, La Negra Pola, now property of Don Sicayo Duchesne, master of Hacienda Paraíso. Next, the boy scribbled something on a long piece of paper, and then it was over. Now Pola's chains were replaced by a thick rope around her wrists. The man brought 5 Africans that day. As he watched, they were pulled up into his wagon. His white shirt stretched across his ample belly and shone in the sun. His tightly woven straw hat covered most of his long hair, which brushed his collar. His dark mustache framed thin lips, and his pointy white teeth bit down hard on his cigar as he took charge of his new possessions. She didn't know it then, but he had bought her as he would buy a breeding mare, and her true nightmare was about to begin. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next reader is Steve Edwards, and he is in Littleton, Mass, and is the author of Breaking into the Backcountry, the story of his 7 months of solitude along the Rogue National Wild and Scenic River in Oregon.
Thank you so much for inviting me to read alongside such powerful writers. I'm still recovering. I'm going to be reading tonight from an essay entitled "When Are Men Dangerous?" on agency, imagination, and what a teacher can do. It's about teaching and storytelling and the ways we find to resist the violence and dehumanization all around us. This particular section is about the poet William Stafford, who was a conscientious objector to World War II. And it's just a little slice of a much longer piece. When are men dangerous? The poet William Stafford wrote in the opening pages of Down in My Heart, a memoir of his imprisonment as a conscientious objector to World War II. He didn't address the question, but let it hang there while he began the story of a day that nearly saw him killed. It was March 22nd, 1942. In McNeil, Arkansas, the fruit trees were blooming. Stafford and 2 friends on furlough from camp talked cordially with a few men in the town square, all of them, quote, loafing around in the Sabbath calm. Bob had a drawing board and painted a watercolor of a dilapidated storefront. George wrote a poem in a notebook. Stafford carried a letter in his shirt pocket and a copy of Leaves of Grass. They had been in Arkansas several months doing soil conservation work. Not all of the neighbors had been friendly, Stafford admitted, but some of the Black families had shown a reciprocal kindness. The men knew to keep a low profile in town. And on the day in question, they had been. Bob painted, George wrote, Stafford read. But once the townspeople learned that these strangers came from the camp near Magnolia, events took a turn. They began to peer over Bob's shoulder as he painted, inquiring as to why he was painting a storefront. They wanted to know what George had written in his notebook. They demanded to see Stafford's letter. As the interrogation gathered steam, the crowd grew. A few men turned into 15, 25. They snatched George's poem, which Stafford described as Sandbergian and a blunderbuss, and hollered at its mention of the railroad, claiming it wasn't poetry, but information. If it was poetry, they said, it would rhyme. Leaves of grass throbbed under my arm, Stafford wrote, but he said nothing. He knew that even a hint of hostility or belligerence could be seen as an invitation to harm. Already, threats were being made, words like yellow and coward issuing from the crowd. A man tore Bob's painting from its drawing board and started to rip it up, only to be stopped by another man who wanted to keep it for evidence. A voice suggested breaking the drawing board over their heads. Another suggested stringing them up. The police arrived and listened to the accusations of spying leveled by the men in the crowd. They studied Bob's painting, and read George's poem. They opened and read the letter in Stafford's pocket, passing it around for the curious to see. They confiscated leaves of grass. For the better part of an hour, Stafford waited and watched, patiently and considerately answering the questions he was asked. Then finally, having given neither the police nor the men of McNeil a reason to escalate the situation, the objectors were swept into a squad car and returned to camp. Before the day was over, Stafford reported 60 to 75 people had joined the scrum, some from towns as far as 10 miles away. They later learned that Bob's painting, George's poem, and Stafford's letter had been put on display at the local police department, evidence that the community was once again safe and secure. When are men dangerous? In the aftermath of the mobbing, the question had an immediate significance. At camp that night, they doubled the watch, fearing retribution. By some grace, none came. But the trouble remained. If their mere presence in town could spark the threat of such violence, how were they to live? Day by day, they answered the question. They pooled their books into a library and formed study groups, gave lectures, staged debates, put on plays, shared music and song. They decided to rise before dawn, to pursue a life of the mind before giving the labor of their bodies to the US Forest Service. For Stafford, rising early to write became a lifelong habit. On one such a morning, he asked, when are men dangerous? Coming on a century later, the question reads like a Zen koan. One thing I have learned from contemplating it is that people aren't only dangerous when they commit and threaten violence. The opposite can also be true. To the men in that mob in Arkansas, conscientious objectors were the dangerous ones. Art and poetry were the threats. Theirs was a view shared widely across the country and propagated by the government. So fundamentally had they wed themselves to the logic of war and nationalistic pride that even the faintest flicker of dissent had to be snuffed out, lest it destroy them. Such fears are common and metastasize from one historical event to the next, from 9/11 to the Boston Marathon bombing to the lies that fomented an insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. Mobs have answers. Poets don't. As a writer who for 50 years rose before first light to set pen to paper, Stafford made a life of transgressing the violence at the heart of American culture. Rather than defend his certainties, he embraced their destruction. Asked at the end of his career which of his poems was his favorite, he said he would trade them all for a shot at the next. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So wow, all of these works have just inspired me deeply. So thank you all, thank you all. And our final reader is Daisy Hernández, and coming all the way from Cincinnati, Ohio, and is the author of The Kissing Bug, a true story of a family, an insect, and a nation's neglect of a deadly disease. And it won the 2022 Penn Gene Stein Book Award. Daisy.
Thank you so much. And hi, everyone. It's so good to be here with all of you, putting it on gallery view so I can see your faces. Yeah, I just thank you to all these writers. It's just incredible to hear you read your own work. That's like a special treat for me. And yeah, I'm going to read from The Kissing Bug. I so appreciate the theme of resistance. It's something that I thought about often as I worked on this book. The Kissing Bug is a book about a neglected disease called Chagas disease, or the kissing bug disease. And it's disproportionately in the US, it's found among Latin American immigrant communities. And it's a parasitic disease and can be very deadly and often goes undiagnosed and has been neglected for a long time. And it's a disease that I began to talk about when I was 6 years old. I was the only fluent member of my immigrant family, only fluent English speaker in my family. And so I would oftentimes translate for my auntie who was diagnosed with Chagas disease and translate for her, interpret between her and medical professionals. And she lived with this disease her whole life. This parasite attacks the heart. It doesn't have, we don't have a cure for this disease. And my auntie, eventually, after many, many years of battling this, lost her life to this disease. And we didn't understand that it was neglected. We thought that she had a rare disease. And in the wake of her passing, I started to look for other families that had faced this disease and also had to negotiate the US healthcare system as well, which can be very unforgiving. And in terms of resistance, I feel like the families who ended up sharing their stories with me, that was such an act of resistance on their part, because they were sometimes really revisiting very painful memories for themselves, hoping to raise awareness about this disease. So I'm going to read from the beginning of the book. The beginning of the book is very much about my relationship with my auntie, who was like a second mom for me. And yeah, we had a complicated relationship, but it sort of sets up the stage for our relationship and everything that comes later. And I'm going to keep an eye on the time. In the 70s, Colombia's civil war remained tucked away in the mountains. Airplanes flew from Bogota without exploding in the sky, and no one worried about being kidnapped for hefty ransoms. At the Palace of Justice, the Supreme Court judges, staffers, and cafeteria workers did not think of dying at the hands of the military or the rebels. All that would come later. Teodora grew up with her parents in Quiroga, a neighborhood on the south end of Bogota. The houses looked like multicolored boxes stacked in the corner of a room, and the sidewalks curved towards stores that sold arepas, buñuelos, and glass bottles of Coca-Cola. The hills rose beyond the roofs, high and sepia tinged, sprouting one-room homes constructed of wood and tar paper, creating at times the impression that poor families were building in the direction of heaven. My abuelos from the town of Rameriquí, a few hours outside the capital, would probably have lived in the hills if it had not been for a government program that granted them a house in the city. The family house had a front yard with 2 banana trees. A window in the living room looked out onto South 33rd Street, and Teodora and my mother and their brothers and sisters, they were a family of 11 children, filled that living room over the years with gossip and a radio that played vallenato songs. The house had 3 bedrooms and accommodated itself to the size of the family. Beds were shared, pillows crisp and communal. Occasionally, another family rented a room so my grandparents, once farmers and now city folks without jobs, could earn extra cash. Behind the main house, rooms were built for 2 of my uncles and their wives and young children. The hens had their coop in the backyard where they huddled in the cold and laid their generous eggs, and at night, surely dreamt of the campo. The youngest of the girls, Teodora, grew up on a merry-go-round of women's hands, of sisters, cousins, comadres, and cuñadas. And maybe for that reason, she spent years referring to one of her oldest sisters as mama. Or perhaps Teodora knew the truth, knew exactly who her mother was, but she loved her doting sister so much that she could think of no higher compliment than mama. As a child, she watched her older sisters make melcocha, a kind of molasses taffy. They heated the molasses, then waited for it to cool enough so that they could pick it up and twist the melcocha into figure 8s on the table, cut it into pieces, and hand it out to friends, primos, neighbors, whoever happened to walk by the front door. Teodora herself had a predisposition toward joy. Her father's drinking did not bother her. She poured the cheap liquor down the drain and never blamed him. The sound of a brother coming home drunk at night and yelling at his wife pinched her ears. But men were men. They swung at each other and drank too much, and still there they were. Or maybe my auntie could afford to be generous since she planned to have a different future. By her late 20s, she was teaching elementary school children in the mornings and in the evenings working towards her bachelor's degree. She paid for the classes from her earnings, and she planned to be la primera, the first girl in the family to graduate from college. She carried herself as if she were made from copper, as if she was important, necessary even. One year, she saved her money to buy knee-high boots and Jackie O-style sunglasses. She gossiped with her cuñadas and nieces about men's faces. Me encantan los hombres con bigotes, she would say, because she thought facial hair on a man delightful, although by all accounts, she had no boyfriend. The first time I met Theodora, I was 8 months old. My mother had been living in New Jersey 6 years by then, having left Colombia for work in the textile factories that dotted the towns along the Hudson River. She had been in the States long enough to marry a skinny Cuban exile, procure a green card, and give birth to me. She bundled me in a pink winter onesie, and we flew together from New York City to Bogota, where Theodora and the other aunties cradled me and changed my diaper and fed me formula. They had a crib ready for me too, and over it they hung an enormous handmade doll with an obedient face and long braids the color of canela. The second time we visited Colombia, I had acquired language. I was 3 years old. It was the summer of 1978, and Mommy and I arrived in Bogota to find Theodora embracing the fashion of the women's movement. She had cut her long, wavy hair into a bob and wore blazers, a scarf around her neck. She looked like a woman who expected to work on Wall Street. Her handbag, thin and boxy, suggested a briefcase. If the family stories are true, Theodora sat with me and the aunties one day, all of them chattering and laughing, and she decided to humor the other women, her older sisters and the cuñadas. In Spanish, she whispered to me, "Say puta." I must have given her a dubious look. The word felt new to my ears, but she insisted. "Puta," I cried to my mother and the aunties married to my uncles. My mouth latched onto the word, puta, puta, puta. The word felt good and hard, like carrying a knife between my teeth. The women all screamed in mock horror, then howled with laughter. I had just called everyone in the room a whore. If my Theodora were alive to read this, she would insist she never taught me vulgarities. No fue así, she would chide. Fue una broma. You're making it sound so serious. It was funny. But I was 3 years old and already negotiating with my auntie's ideas about language and transgression. Theodora's sickness began with a swelling. Around 1979, her belly inflated under the blouses that she wore to teach at the local elementary school. She thought she was bloated and drank her mother's herbal teas. Nada. The discomfort persisted for a day, then another. Her belly stretched. In the shower, she would have looked down and seen it, her growing abdomen. Her brothers teased. They know women who got knocked up. Tell us, they said, who's the father? Theodora scowled and laughed. She was not pregnant. She had barely kissed a man. She waved her brothers away. After another day or so, she ran a fever. The ice cubes melted on her forehead and the towels grew moist, soaking the heat from her body. At the hospital, La Clínica Fray Bartolomé de las Casas, the nurse handed Theodora a baby blue nightgown with a pattern of stars. A pain must have torn through her body. Thea turned to her sister and begged, "Pray the rosary for me." The nurses looked at my auntie's belly. It was not the first time they had seen a woman pregnant and young, unmarried and terrified. They told Thea's sister that it was most likely an embarazo ectópico, the baby growing in her fallopian tubes. In the hospital room, Theodora lay in bed and her sister paid 30 pesos to have a rollaway bed brought in so she could stay the night. They recited the rosary together. Bendito es el fruto de tu vientre. Then Theodora felt a chill. Tengo frío, she said to her sister. Give me my coat. She pointed at an empty chair. Her sister prayed harder. It was one thing to have a fever and another to lose your mind. The gloved hands wheeled Theodora into an operating room. She might have kept her eyes open and watched the light above the nurse's face, the honey-tinted halo. She would have heard the instruments tinkling on the tray, the unwanted music of paper rustling, latex gloves snapping into place, the hum of orders being issued. She could not have heard the blade, its silver face, pressing into her belly. After the exploratory surgery, the doctors told her sister, "Tiene los intestinos de 10 personas." My auntie's large intestine had dilated, widened, begun to go loose inside her body. She had enough of a large intestine for 10 people. The doctors offered a colostomy bag. It would get her through her last year of college. And when she graduated, that bag hung from the side of her belly. The doctors believed she might live a year, maybe 2. No one suspected a parasite, at least not yet. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Oh, okay. So we all have to go out and buy everybody's book so we can find out like what happens and how everybody, gets through. Or I want to read more essays. I want to read more of each of the stories that I heard. So thank you. You just made my day. And I've been having a hard, week or two, and now I'm lifted up. So that is one of the things that I see books and writing doing for social movements. Someone used to say to me, like, "You're just preaching to the choir." And I would reply, the choir needs to get some good words too. And then also, I haven't heard these sermons, right? So it's really helpful to have so many perspectives as I struggle through whatever I'm struggling through. And it gives my little narrow moment such wide berth that I'm like, oh, right, I'm alive with these people. So that's what you all do for me. So I want to ask you, how do you see writing and books contributing to social movements? Who would like to start? Who would like to? Somebody just wave a hand, or I'll pick you. You want me to pick you? Because I will do that. Okay, Neema is laughing. So Neema, I pick you. Go for it.
Oh, good. Okay. I think that one of the real challenges that we have sometimes here is that we're only offered one narrative, and it's often a really reductive one. And so when we only have that single narrative, I say that as somebody from Appalachia, which really has one book that everybody associates with it, and that book really flattens how people understand that part of the country. And it makes it really easy to write off people and place when you only have one narrative. And so I guess I think that the role of literature is to complicate those narratives and to really challenge people to hold one another with more empathy and more nuance. And that's really the only way forward, right? The way forward is in relationship. The way forward is in seeing each other more fully. And I think that even if we're not proximate to each other physically, words give us the ability to get proximate to each other in a way that I think helps us to move forward.
Okay, I'm from Pittsburgh, so I feel you. And I grew up there, and I'm out in West Virginia, so yay, and also, all over that. So, and I'm now in Massachusetts, so I have that, almost like two worlds, two very different worlds. Survival of the friendliest. So that's, really, with anybody else, Daisy, you just laughed at that. So I'm going to pick the laughers. Survival of the friendliest. Do you want to add anything to how writing and books contribute to social movements?
Yeah, I'm just thinking of our social movements of the last decade, movements for trans visibility, movements against gun violence, all the amazing undocumented youth who have organized in their communities. And I know from my conversations with them that they have been so shaped by the books that they have read. So actually this summer, 20 years ago, my friend and I co-edited a feminist anthology called Colonize This. And when we went to do a new edition of it that came out I'm like, what year are we in? But it came out in 2019. So we wanted to basically invite writers for the new edition who were, as we had been in our 20s, our early 20s, and at a very particular time in our life in terms of our politics and our social consciousness. And it was just amazing, really amazing to talk to all these young women of color, and to hear how, you know, some of them had been shaped by that book. Like it was the book that they had read alongside of Audre Lorde's work, alongside of Sherry Moraga's work. And their activism was like so informed by multiple generations of writers of color. So absolutely, like I think sometimes that connection is not so apparent to people from the outside, but in these one-on-one conversations, I've really seen the way that the books and literature have informed their activism.
Right. I mean, just to combine what both of you are saying, like we are not alone. You know, we're in this enormous story. That story is multifaceted. There is not one story. There's like a multiverse of stories. And if I can tap into that, then I have so much more insight. It's called like humanity, right? And that's who we are. It's not the single story with limited vision, you know, limited world, but, you know, story allows us to see all over the world and also into ourselves. So, does anybody else want to speak to this? I won't force you. Okay, yay, Dahlma.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I write fiction, and one of the reasons that I write fiction is because for the longest time, I looked at history and I got data, I got information. But by writing fiction, see, if I hear 100,000 people disappeared in Argentina, my head can't wrap itself around that. Okay. But if I take one person and write the story of this one character, then it's on a human level that everyone can understand. And so when I write about Paula, we all know that there were African women used as breeders in the United States and other parts of the world. But what does that mean? What does that smell like? What does that feel like? What does that do to one's body? And so what I try very hard to do in the fiction is invite the reader into the skin of the character, so that you experience their life. And so I think of history as dealing with experience from the outside in, and fiction dealing with it from the inside out.
Yes.
And that's why I continue to write fiction, because even when people have the data, they seem to ignore it or they can't absorb it. Maybe by discussing it in a novel, first of all, they can stop accusing each other. And second of all, they can walk in someone else's shoes.
They can reframe, right? And shift how they can experience the world. So Thérèse or Steve, would you like to speak to this? Or I can ask you another question, a different question.
I can just say that as someone who teaches first year writing to a lot of future police officers, that the humanity that literature brings to diverse voices that they don't often in my, in the students in my classes have encountered in their lives, that I'm really grateful for those stories to represent lives that are beautiful and full of struggle and, the desire to be free, and the community that can build up around, the shared experience of diving into that work is powerful to behold.
Thérèse, would you like to say?
Well, I would like to say, first of all, that it was such a treat to hear everyone, and thank you for bringing us together. I mean, I think the way I think about writing is a communal act. I mean, I know when I'm writing, there's this desire to connect with others, and it's a wonderful relationship between writers and readers. And the way I see, I do, Dahlma's words resonated with me because I also write fiction, and the way I see fiction is that's how I understand the world, and that's how history becomes alive for me. And it is also a way of allaying that feeling of loneliness, because I do remember, as I was developing as a young person, finding the right books for me just opened up words and told me that I wasn't alone in this, and it has built community. So I think that's very powerful.
Yeah, that experience of someone knowing you and you've never met them, and maybe they were even 100 years ago or 2,000 miles away, but there you are, and they talk right to you. It's like, oh my God, I'm feeling it right now. The last few years have been trying times. I'll just say that, trying times. I mean, March 2020, the world shifted. I mean, there was all kinds of stuff already going on. And then there was this overlay that made us look at all the things that were already going on. So how has that been for you all as writers? How have you dealt with the challenges of that, the despair of that, and the hope that, Daisy mentioned we've got these young people, because I'm like looking at 70, and I, see a lot of young people, and they have a lot of hope, and I'm glad because they have many years to push through. So how have you all dealt with, all the turmoil of the last couple of years as writers? Who would like to start on that? Anybody? Well, what have you been writing for the last couple of years? How about we start with that? What have you been writing?
I can start.
Yeah, go for it.
So in March of 2020 is when, we went into lockdown, and so I had a lot of conflicting feelings. I was very stressed out. I'm a teacher, and I had no idea how to teach online. So there was that. And I was also doing a revision of my novel. And it was a very strange feeling, because when the world kind of stopped, it was, and there was nothing else to do but stay home or maybe take walks, teach, and then that sort of thing. It was very reminiscent for me of the beginning of the war in Lebanon, when I was a young person, and the fighting was still far away. So it wasn't that scary, and it was at the beginning, before it became a proxy war, it was a militia war, so they weren't, the weapons weren't very sophisticated. But it was enough to keep us home. There was no school, and we stayed home. And all of a sudden, there was this opening to get to know our neighbors really well, and to do things we had never done before. So while there was danger all around us, and we were hiding, and so it felt so eerily the same for me in the beginning, that there was danger, that we were hiding, and yet at the same time, time stood still, and there was time to do, people started doing things. Not for everyone, that wasn't true for everyone. Those of us who were lucky enough to have jobs and be able to stay home. And so I don't think that if I had not been already working on revising my novel, I don't think I would have been able to write anything new. It was just too much. There was just too much going on, and I was very, very distracted by so many things. But having a project underway just anchored me. And I have to say also that with some friends, we started meeting regularly on Zoom and writing friends and writing together. So that sense of community was also extremely helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Anybody else? Neema.
I feel like I queried in 2020, and so in some ways I felt really lucky that I was done with something. because I don't think I could have started something new in some ways. I found myself, I'm a teacher also. I teach in Boston, and I think the most of my writing over the last couple of years has really been advocacy writing. I've been writing lots and lots and lots about what's going on in schools, what young people are experiencing, the disconnect between what people in charge think should be happening and what actually should be happening. And so I feel like that's where most of my writing energy has gone, is just into trying to like amplify what young people are saying and try to offer some different perspective on what maybe should be happening that isn't happening.
Okay. Anybody else?
I
Yes.
also,
Go for it.
I live in the Bronx, which was really hard hit by the pandemic. Even though I live in the North Bronx, I could hear the sirens going on all night, picking up people. Eventually, we needed so many people hospitalized that they just parked dozens of ambulances in the Bronx Zoo so that they would be closer to other people who were basically dying. And then the refrigerated trucks came in to hold all the cadavers of people that the hospitals couldn't hold anymore. I really felt like the world was coming to an end. The whole political situation for 2 years before had been horrendous, and this was like the final straw. But I started to meditate again. And in my meditation, my grandfather said to me, "We have been through much worse. We have been through much worse, and we are here, and we will be here. This is the little time. We will be here for the long time." And he said, "Look at what you write." And what I write about is, I write neo-slave narratives, not about how slavery defeated us, but about how it made us stronger. And so my writing became a balm. And so I know about all the losses that we have had, but I started focusing on the gifts that I received through this. So through this, I sold my new novel, and through this, I got to re-experience what I have already written and decided, this isn't so bad. Maybe this can help somebody. It certainly helped me. So I'm not so much conflicted as I see two sides of a coin. I see everything that we've lost. And then that makes me hunger more to find the things that we've gained. And that's the only way I could deal with the depression.
Yeah. So Daisy, or
I'll just
Daisy.
I'd like to just add to that, because that reminds me that, I felt equal parts despair and hope. As Dahlma said, just so much reason for despair. I think for me, so much of my book, The Kissing Bug, was about like, how do we choose what diseases we pay attention to and which ones we neglect, which is essentially like, how do we choose who lives and who dies, which I feel like COVID put in front of our faces in a really intense way, and was cause for a lot of despair, just to see how, and there's no reason that we should have the rates of death that we have from COVID. At the same time, what I felt hope around was like really early on in the pandemic, actually, to see Black scholars step up and push back against this kind of narrative that began to form that was blaming Black and Brown people for dying for the disease because they weren't healthy enough to take care of themselves. Like, just to see Black scholars, journalists, BIPOC, other BIPOC folks, and white allies standing up and pushing up against that narrative and explicitly pointing to all the systemic inequities that put our communities at such risk, that actually really gave me hope. Like, I just kept thinking, if this had happened 30 years ago, without social media, without the changes that we've had in terms of higher ed and more BIPOC folks visible and present, I don't know, it would have been, I don't know that we would have had that pushback and been able to hear it in the same way. So that's given me a lot of hope. Like a lot has changed, even as so much has stayed the same too.
Steve?
Well, just in a very small way, underneath all the larger stories that were so difficult and painful, being at home in the early portion of the pandemic had a sort of a strange impact on me, is that the cooking that I started to do was my grandparents' food. And I started to think about how they would, be content to pull a chair out onto the grass and sit and talk and tell stories among themselves and to me. And, it got a little tight in our little home with my son. He had a very hard time and was very depressed and during the pandemic. And one way I really had to communicate with him that's affected by writing too is by telling him the story of the great grandparents he never knew, and reaching back to them and my memories of them pushed a lot of my work forward.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So I think we have like time for one more question. So, what I'm going to ask you all to say is one more thing about being a public intellectual. All of you have such wisdom and insight and beauty and poetry, whether you write poetry or not, to offer the world, right? So, how'd you get there, right? How did you find your way? I mean, because many of you are teachers. I'm a teacher. I teach at Smith. So I know how demanding that is. And you sound like good teachers. So, how do you, balance all of those things and find the time to write, find the time to find the hope, find the time to face the despair? What can you offer other writers in terms of things that have worked for you as public intellectuals? Okay, somebody start. How about Thérèse?
In terms of the time, balancing the time, that is really, really, really difficult, and I'm not very good at that. I write mostly in the summer, during summer vacation, so things take a long time to finish. I try very hard to do things during the year, but so what feeds me, kind of like I think to myself, why am I still doing this when it's so hard? And it is something that I can't quite help, because I tried. I said to myself, okay, that's it. I'm not, but it doesn't work.
That chance. There you are, writing again. Yes.
Exactly. And there are all these ideas bubbling now for short stories and that sort of thing. And I mean, I think it's a fundamental desire to connect, and comes that public, I'm rather a reserved person, so these venues here are a little stressful for me. So I'd rather write and have you read.
Yes.
But it is, I found that, after Loom was published, I found that I really love actually doing readings, and love connecting with people and reading my work. It sounds better when I read it than it's on the page. And so I try to find that to feed me, and try to like venues like this one where people appreciate and listen. So that keeps me going. Although it I have to say, it goes up and down, and sometimes I just, it's not happening. Yeah.
Yeah. I just want to say that you totally in your reading drew me into the moment, going down the stair. I mean, I was there. It was like very dramatic. It was just like what Steve said. It was like a storytelling moment. And I was transported to that place and time. So yes, thank you. Someone else? Anybody else?
I'll jump
Daisy?
in just to add to that. I think what really helped me with starting out was to find community. So literally, like, somehow through word of mouth, found out about a group of women who were getting together and just having writing workshops among themselves without a teacher or anything, just giving each other feedback on their work. That was huge for me, so big. But I think like a good place to start the writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction or poetry, is to like think about the questions that you have, you know, about your own life, about the world, about your communities, and like write towards those questions, you know, or towards some kind of answers that you may have.
Yeah. Yeah, the bug, I mean, your book, you know, like, and I love the title. The title makes me want to read it. And then your reading of it, you know, draws me in. And then your connection to it, all of those things make it very, very rich. So anybody else? Neema?
Yeah. I think the other thing that that can help is sort of thinking about the who you're writing for, and that can be a really powerful motivator. I think when I was writing my book, initially I was writing it just for me. And then along the way, I was like, oh, but like when I was growing up, this book didn't exist and I didn't have any mirrors. And so what does it mean that now there are going to be mirrors for queer kids in Appalachia who don't necessarily have one? And then you start to hear from those queer kids in Appalachia who are like, this is a mirror. And then you just want to keep writing and writing and writing because we all know what it's like when we find mirrors, and we know what having books as mirrors can do for somebody, right? And so once you've had that experience, I think all you want to do is keep holding up a mirror for somebody else, just because that is, I think, for a lot of young people, like a lifeline. And so if you can hold them kind of close to you as you're writing, I think that's another thing that can really help you keep going.
And you'd be surprised how like old people need mirrors too. So I got a letter from someone from the University of Pittsburgh who read my recent novel, who had a non-binary character, and they went, "That's me." So it's ongoing, you know, like you might be speaking out and you don't know who's hearing you, but they are hearing you and they try to get back in touch. So Dahlma or Steve? Dahlma?
I also was a teacher for 30 years. And what I find is that now that I am writing full time, I just have a bigger classroom. And I don't have behavior issues, behavior problems. And I don't have to correct anybody's work.
No, your own.
My own, which is bad enough, but okay. But I feel like I'm writing, so many people have said to me, I didn't know this about Puerto Rico, you know, or some people didn't even know that Puerto Ricans were citizens. So there was such a lack of information. And someone said to me, well, I'm totally ignorant about this. And this was a white person. And I said, I don't like using the word ignorant because it has a very negative connotation. I prefer that people have been either miseducated or not educated enough, because I feel that as an Afro-Puerto Rican, I have been invisible and voiceless in this society until very recently. And so it's my job to create a face and a voice so that people can hear it. And the other thing that has happened is that all this time of isolating has made me really embrace my elderhood, right? And objectively think of what can I leave for the next generation. Because, and storytellers are big in my novels. I have women, and for my third one, it will be men, if I can get this right. Choruses, basically, that inhabit my work. And it's always elderly people who are passing on information. So I think I think there has been a click, a change in my perception of myself. And I don't think that happens unless you have peace and quiet for an extended period of time. When I was teaching, all I could do was get home by 4 o'clock so I could turn on Oprah and not have to do any more problem solving. So, I just wanted to be left alone.
Yes.
Well, now I'm alone. So what do I do with my time? How do I apportion it? But what I've realized is I haven't retired. I've just changed my
Shifted.
classroom environment.
Yeah. Okay. Steve.
I as I'm listening to everybody, I'm just loving the things that you're saying, and it resonates with me too. And I was just reflecting as I heard you about what a kind of radical, loving act it is to give yourself time and permission to chase this activity that has no guarantee of success whatsoever. But that when you just sort of devote yourself to it, like Neema was saying, there are audiences of people out there who need your story. Need it. And and if that doesn't get you motivated, I don't know, what will.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think, you all are all throwing out lifelines to us, right? And I needed some today. So thank you, and I'm going to look up all your books. I want to stay in touch. I want to know what you're writing next. And I want to make sure that we up the sales. So you can go and buy their books, right? There was a thing in the chat. So up the sales. I can't deal with chat and talking to people. I'm I have to stay focused, but I will get your books. So thank you so much for coming and sharing. And thank you for writing it in the first place, because I know how hard that was. And I know how much of yourselves that you have offered to us. So thank you for that. And I guess I will now, this is, I think, our time limit, right? We went 5 minutes over, but I'm going to turn it back over to whoever is taking it from me. So somebody from Forbes or Straw Dogs. But again, get those books. The info is in the chat. Get them now or tomorrow at the latest.
That was a really amazing close to an enlightening and entertaining evening. Thank you, Andrea, and to all our authors. This was inspiring for us to be more understanding people, a more compassionate community. Thank you for all your work and for sharing it with us tonight. Also, thanks to the Forbes Library, and Molly Moss, and Becky Jones for managing the technology tonight. Great job. Also, thanks to all the Straw Dog writers, the volunteers who helped put this event together, including our committee, which was Marianne, Anna, myself, and Becky. And thanks to Kim, Gerould, for connecting our event tonight to the history of our community.
And definitely go on the walk. They do a walk, you must go and walk through Florence and see all the wonders.
Yes. So the event is officially over now. We are leaving the Zoom room open a little bit longer in case people want to socialize or follow up or chat a little bit. But I will, for Straw Dog and the event, say thank you for coming and good night.